Good to see you this morning. Glad that you're able to be here. Just a couple things to get us started, or a couple things you should be aware of. First of all, a lot of you know my father-in-law, Jerry Pratt. We've been praying for him. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he's nearing the end of his life. The family's got a text message thread, and they're just kind of checking in every so often. But it looks like, you just never know with these things, but it looks like it's probably days versus anything else. So he's in hospice right now. But we have a couple of member families who are related, and of course a lot of you know him. He's been a big part. And as you know, if you know Jerry, he just kind of does things his own way. So we just don't know what the next few days or maybe even weeks are going to hold. But we'd sure appreciate the prayers for the family as you think about them. We are in our final element of this series. We've been talking about the elements, the essence of a belief, and we're in the final element here. Occasionally, I invite people to church. You'd think that would, make sense, right? I work at a church. There's people who need to find a church, and so sometimes I'm able to have these conversations. It's always a little teeny tiny awkward for me because it does feel weird to say, hey, come listen to me talk at you. But I don't phrase it that way. I try to make it sound a little better. But recently, there was this guy I've known for a little while, and it kind of dawned on me. I'm like, why haven't I ever interacted with him? Why haven't I ever invited him to church? And so I said, hey, you should come to church sometime. We would love to have you. And his response was, normally there's a polite, I'll think about it. If they're going to say no, I'll think about it. I'll, whatever. But his response was kind of quick, and it wasn't impolite, it wasn't rude, but it was just, church isn't for me. Just church isn't for me. Now, this is tough because if you were a doctor and you were talking to somebody who said, clinics aren't for me, or if you worked at a restaurant and somebody said restaurants aren't for me, you'd want to know, right? You'd want to know a little bit what's this? There's a story there, but it's sensitive. You don't want to just dive right in the deep end because there's something there. And so I said, can I ask you a personal question? He said yes, and I said, why? Why isn't church for you? Can you explain? And his response, again, was really short, really quick, and he just said, I had a bad experience. I had a bad experience at church, so I'm done with church. Now, I'm fairly certain his bad experience wasn't stale communion. It wasn't that the preacher was boring, although maybe that played a part. It wasn't bad singing. It wasn't a carpet stain. It wasn't not being able to find a parking spot. I'm fairly certain, I think we can be pretty accurate in guessing that the bad experience was someone had hurt him in some way. Someone had mistreated him, someone was unkind to him, something had happened, there was some bad experience, and it could be a real wide range, but something along those lines. Now, he didn't say, Jesus isn't for me. He said, church isn't for me. Now, there are actually public approval numbers about this because this is unfortunately common. So there's actual polls. So if you were to go out and ask the average person, you would find out that 87% of people like Jesus. 87%. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Are there 13% that are it's no good. Who are those people? I haven't met those people. But according to public opinion polls, 87% of people like Jesus, but only 21% of people like the church or value the church. Now, these are people that don't go to church. I'm hoping that it would be a little higher if we were polling people in the room. But only 21% approval. Now, that's still beating Congress, but it's not saying very much at all. People do not seem to like church very well, and some of you are like, who cares, Patrick? Who cares about public approval numbers? I agree. Who cares about public approval numbers? I'm not necessarily worried about the public approval numbers. What I'm worried about is that gap between the 21% and the 87%. What happened that so many people seem to appreciate Jesus and struggle with the church? What's going on there? That's the real struggle. Jesus seems to be the real deal, but his followers seem to be falling pretty far short. And what's going on? And some of us are sitting in this room saying, hey, I'm one of those followers. I'm part of the church. I create the church. And you're saying that only 21% of the world likes me? Well, that's where we are. This is the reality. This is what we got to deal with. We're here. Now, some of you may feel like, I feel pretty good about the church. I'm here on a Sunday morning. But I think we still need to kind of think through this. What's going on? What's going on? What is the reason for that gap? In my experience, the gap is between expectation and experience. People had an expectation of what church would be based on Jesus, right? They had some idea. They expected love because of what Jesus taught, but they got to church and maybe they experienced less than love. Maybe they experienced indifference. They expected grace and maybe they experienced judgment, or expected trust and experienced betrayal, expected acceptance, experienced exclusion. And I bet what happened to my church isn't for me, friend. I bet he had an expectation, didn't have that experience, and decided not to open himself up to vulnerability again. For a lot of Americans, here's the thinking. Here's where we are. A lot of Americans. And by the way, I think this is probably worth pointing out that this is primarily a Western mindset. This is not something you'll find all over the country, but this is certainly something you'll find in the U.S. You probably can think of a neighbor. You can probably think of a relative who is like this. But this isn't something you'll experience worldwide. This is sort of a uniquely American Western phenomenon. They'll say, I believe in God. I even believe in the Bible. I certainly believe in Jesus. I do not believe in the church. I do not believe in the church. If we were going to make stickers, it would look something like this. I love Jesus, just not the church. And we can get these printed up and have them for you. We'll mail them to you, $50 shipping and handling, but otherwise it'll be a great deal. I love Jesus, just not the church. And you could probably turn on late night TV and understand where some of that sentiment comes from, because if people's perception are those televangelists that are saying, hey, I'll pray for you, just send in a little bit of money and I'll make sure your prayers get heard by the big man upstairs, you can understand why people start to develop this mistrust of Jesus. I totally relate. Now, here's the thing. I sympathize. I work at a church. I work here, and I sympathize with that sentiment. I can understand that sentiment. I have had bad church experiences. Isn't that shocking? I work at a church, and I've had bad church experiences. My very first one was when I was 12 years old. We didn't have a lot of church options. This was not the Midwest where there was a church every street corner. And so we found this church, and it was one of the few that we could go to, and they were a bad church. I don't know how else you explain it. They were a bad church. Now, we shared 99.9% of spiritual DNA with this small group of people. We shared everything that truly mattered about God and about Jesus and about salvation and about the Bible. But they had one extra thing that should have been way down on the list that they had elevated to an essential, and they had made a pillar of their doctrine. And because of that one thing, when we showed up and they quizzed us, I shouldn't say they quizzed us, they quizzed my parents. I'm 12, what do I know? I'm just along for the ride. When they quizzed my parents, they said, oh, well, that's going to be a real problem. That's going to be a real issue. How many of you are very curious? You want me to tell you what that was? I'm actually not going to tell you this morning, just in case some of you are, come find me later. I'll talk to you later about it. I won't tell you what that specific thing was. So what they did is they let us attend, but that was it. And they were very clear to make sure that we knew we were not included. We were outsiders. And so I thought this was kind of interesting. I was asking my parents about this, like, what was it like for them? So 0 participation in church life, no teaching, no doing a communion talk, no praying, no nothing. In fact, I just found this out recently. My mom said she couldn't even bring a Jell-O salad to the church picnic. I mean, God forbid that had you brought something to the church picnic that you might start to think that you're one of the in crowd. Now, here's my contribution. Here, you have to accept me now because you like my casserole. Couldn't even do that. Interestingly, they would accept one thing from us. Oh, you guys know. They were totally fine taking our contributions of money, but nothing else. Now, if the parents were kind of standoffish and distant, imagine what the kids were like, because believe it or not, this was a small church. I know it's shocking. How could a church like this, that sounds so wonderful and loving and gracious, be small? But they were a small church. Now, if the parents were kind of mean, imagine what the kids were like. And I just remember standing outside the front of that building and just totally being intentionally made to feel like I did not belong, that I was an outsider, that I wasn't supposed to participate here. That's kind of tough. Now, that's one bad church experience for me, and some of you are like, oh, cry me a river, Patrick. So a few people didn't like you. Who cares? And I realize, I get it. There are church experiences that range from kind of the mild, like I'm sharing with you, to the absolutely appalling, right? There's a wide range of experiences. I'm not trying to say that mine is somehow the worst, but you still have to wrestle with questions. That raises questions in a young kid's mind. Is this what Christianity is? This is what Christianity produces? This is where, are all churches like this? Or how about this one? Why am I more accepted by my non-church friends? And why am I more comfortable in my outside of the church relationships than I am inside? People have to wrestle with those questions based on church experiences. Here's a sad truth. You're not going to hear this very often at a church, but here's a sad truth. Everyone has had a bad church experience. Every single one of you in this room has had a bad church experience. It may be mild, you know. It may be that someone didn't say hi to you on a Sunday morning, and it may be absolutely terrible. But everyone has one, and that's the problem. And I totally understand why people start to think, like, is this whole thing even worth it? Church isn't for me. So here's the question that we're going to wrestle with this morning. Is it reasonable to believe in and pursue a connection and have a relationship with church? Is it reasonable? Now, I'm not going to keep you in suspense, right? It would be like asking the IRS agent, is it reasonable for me to pay taxes? I mean, I work at a church. It's reasonable. The answer is yes. The answer is overwhelmingly yes, and we're going to get to that. But I want us to understand that I'm not trying to have blinders on when we talk about this, like to try to pretend everything's perfect, because in fact, that's sometimes how churches get incredibly bad, is because they just try to sweep all the bad stuff under the rug and pretend it doesn't exist, pretend we aren't human, pretend that we're perfect, and it just creates worse and worse and worse situations. Is it reasonable to believe in church? Yes, but you need to know why. So 2 things to keep in mind as we talk. Every story is different. Every story is different. Your situation is different than mine, is different than the person next to you. Every story is different. And so I don't know the particulars of your bad church experience. Parents, when your child scrapes their knee, one response may be like, a little hug and walk it off. Another response, legitimate, may be, I got to take this kid to go get stitches. Those are different responses to something kind of similar, but you as a person have to determine which one is it, or you as a parent have to determine which is it. And so in your particular scenario, I don't know, are we talking about a scraped knee experience, or are we talking about a surgery experience? I don't know. And I'm not going to try to, so as you think about, well, I had this bad experience, how does what Patrick's saying relate to that? You're going to have to figure that out, or come talk to me or someone else later. We'll talk about that. We're talking about perspective this morning, not prescription. We're talking about how we think about this, how we think about the entity of the church. So I don't know if your story requires triage or a pat on the back, and I'm sorry, that sounds tough. And secondly, every church is different. Every church is different. I don't want to speak for every organization that has the word church on its sign or calls itself a church. Kareen and I are watching a documentary right now about a church where I would encourage everybody to run away as fast as you can. If you've gotten to the point where they're making a documentary about you, it must be bad, right? I'm not trying to defend that group of people. I don't know anything about them. So is this, and the question I think we'd have to ask ourselves, and let me just say this, just as real quick, this is a little aside. There's a writer, speaker, Jackie Hill Perry, that writes a little bit about church stuff like this, and she just gives 3 guidelines for whether or not a church is healthy, and I thought these were really helpful. She says, is the church trying to be more like Jesus, or are they just saying they're trying to be more like Jesus? And I think that's really good. You should look at the substance, not the perfection, but you should look at the direction of the people in that church. Are they perfect? No, probably not. But where are they trying to head? Where are they actively trying to head? Or are they just saying, we've got it all figured out? I think that's very helpful. She also says, is the leadership above criticism at your church? Is the leadership above criticism? If we are, nobody's told me that yet. And then she also says, do they allow disagreement? Can people legitimately hold different theological perspectives about a wide range of issues and still feel comfortable being together? I thought those were really valuable to think about. So I don't know what you're thinking, but we're not trying to defend every organization that calls itself a church. So let's do this. Let's talk about this. We'll cruise through these. Number one, the critics are often right when it comes to church. I don't know. Actually, I don't know if that's ever been said from a stage at a church on a Sunday morning before. People, when they criticize church, are often correct. Their criticisms are correct. Maybe the criticisms that you've had of me or of church were absolutely right. Their criticisms are often correct. Let's call it what it is. There is a lot of failure in the big C church, the big universal church. There is a lot of failure. There's a lot of failure. A friend of mine tells me about his childhood church, and I'm like, how are you still a Christian? Because your church makes the days of our lives plots just look like nothing, like a knitting circle. Like this church there was embezzlement, affairs, shootings, and this wasn't like among the members. This was in the building. This stuff was happening. And he says, yeah, I grew up. I was like, wow, did you make it through? There is a lot of failure in these organizations that people call the church. But sadly, it's nothing new. You can rewind time a little bit. You can go back to the 19th century, and you can find with the slavery debate, there were dedicated, hardcore Christians working for abolition, but there were people who claimed to believe in Jesus and be shaped by Scripture that were supporting the practice of slavery. I mean, that when you talk to someone who doesn't believe in church, they start to point to things like, well, look at the history of the church. It's not good. There are some real dark spots. How about you go back even further to around the 11th century, you get the Crusades, right? That wasn't a good era. The evangelism technique of repent or I will kill you is very effective, but it's not very healthy. And we now look back like, it was 1,000 years ago. We've got some things right then. I hope so, but people are like, but that's your history, that's your past. Or go back to the 2nd century. There was a Greek philosopher by the name of Porphyry who wrote a book called Against the Christians. This is in the 2nd century. And I was reading about it this week. It was 15 volumes. He wrote in an encyclopedia about how bad Christians were. And the funny thing is we don't have any of it today because the Christians burned all of them. And I'm not really surprised. But we have a record of little clips and pieces that he wrote. Even as early as the 2nd century, there were people who were like, this whole thing is a disaster. There's just no good that can come from it. But go back even further. Have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought about the bulk of your New Testament that you're holding in your hands is critiques of the church written by the apostles? They were critiques, not every page certainly, but a lot of it was these guys trying to say, you're driving me crazy, you're getting it wrong. It was Paul. Look at what he said in 1 Corinthians 11:17. He said in the following directives, this is in your Bible, I have no praise for you, Paul says. Zero praise. I can't even find a silver lining, and I'm an optimist. For your meetings do more harm than good. That's in the 1st century. They're already saying, hey, we're seeing problems here. You're getting it wrong. You are causing harm to one another. This is what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, their problem was the Lord's Supper that we just participated in, and they were introducing some division and some classism into the Lord's Supper, and so it was very, very different, but it's fascinating to read about. But Paul was like, this is a disaster. You do more harm than good. In fact, you can go back even further before the church existed and read what Jesus said, like Matthew 23:13. These are religious people who follow God. And he writes, woe to you, teachers of the law, Pharisees, you hypocrites, you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. I mean, wow, that's wild. Just, can you imagine someone's like, I want to know more about God, and slam. That's Jesus' problem with them. And he says, you yourselves do not enter. You don't enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. So there you go, right? Case closed. Even Paul and Jesus were skeptics. So Patrick, how do you pull out of this nosedive now? How do you make this sound like the church is something good after reading all that? You can understand. Now, the I love Jesus but not church, it recognizes real problems in people. And the instinct to hold people accountable is a righteous instinct. It is a right thing to hold people accountable. But that as a solution backs away from the problem, and Jesus and Paul rushed toward the problem. See, what we want to do is we want to create distance from things that we don't like, and Jesus moved toward things that he didn't like. He moved toward people that nobody else would move toward. Paul was writing these churches, pleading these churches, saying, I'm going to come visit you, not because he was like, forget you, I love Jesus and not the church, but because he wanted healing for these people. Our instinct is to move away. Their instinct was to move toward. At the end of Matthew 23:37, this is Jesus who had just said these scathing things, and he says to these people, he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, and he's just talking about the people of Israel who had rejected God on so many levels. You who kill the prophets and stone those who sent you, how often I have longed to gather you under as children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. And you weren't willing. I want closeness. I desire intimacy, not rejection. That's not what the goal is here. In fact, Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 33, at the end of that thing saying where you've done more harm than good, he writes, so then, my brothers and sisters, when you gather together, you should all eat together. Be together. You find someone you're struggling with, invite them over for dinner. You should be in the room together. You should be at the table together. It's much harder, but it's not about distance. It's not about pushing people away. It's about drawing closer together. And I think that's so valuable for us to understand. Our instinct is to discard and dispatch and throw away. And that's not what we're called to do at all with imperfect people. We're called to move toward them and find healing and reconciliation. That's the whole point of the gospel. God could have done away with us and said, forget you, I'm writing this whole thing off. But he didn't. It's about redemption and drawing us back into a relationship. It's so important. It's so powerful. Secondly, early in my marriage, I had this friend that did not like Corrine at all. Oh, that was quite... You probably didn't hear that online, but there was a low rumble through the room where people were like, uh-oh. Now, you said uh-oh because you know Corrine, and you know she's not going to put up with that, but... He didn't like it. I don't know if they had gotten off on the wrong foot. I don't know what had happened, but there had been something. Now, it wasn't Carine's fault. It was all this friend's fault. He couldn't stand her. And at first, we just thought he was going through something. There was just something in his life and something he needed to work out. So we tried the closeness thing. We tried to, invite him over for dinner. So, in fact, I remember this one evening where we invited him over, and just the whole time, he's like, just these comments, just these, you can't quite nail it down, but it's kind of mean-spirited. It would be like, he would say stuff like, oh, is this the first time you made this recipe? And you're like, is that an insult? I can't tell. It seems like an insult. I think it's an insult. And then, oh, my mom makes this so well. It's the best I've ever had. Why did you need to bring that up? Or one thing he said later on the meal is like, you could ease off the salt. There's probably a little. And you're like, we invited you over. What are you doing, man? So that dinner didn't go super well, but even when she would say stuff, he would just kind of roll his eyes, and it's just body language. It was just, So now he and I went out later, just the two of us. We went out to do some stuff together, and even while we're out, he's having these conversations with me, and he would be like, you have to admit, she's kind of annoying. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? Yeah, well, she's so direct. How do you put up with that? Come on. You got to put your foot down about that kind of stuff. And you should do something about this. So it was this constant sniping, this constant complaining, and it was weird. And finally, at one point in this conversation, he just turned to me, and he was really direct, and he said, Patrick, I like you, but I cannot stand your wife. Anyway, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. I want you to read this with me. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I told this friend, it's no big deal. You and I can stay friends. You don't have to like the people I live my life with. It's no big deal. Don't worry about it. You and I can still have a connection, but you don't have to like my wife. You don't have to like my family. You and I can still be really close friends, though. How many of you are a little confused? You're like, wait, I do not have a friend that hates Corrine. I never have. In fact, how long could a relationship like that truly last? Really? Most people who know both Corrine and I like Corrine much better. So just want you to know that. It's really the other way around. It would be tough to have a relationship with someone that hated my spouse. How does that work for us to say, I love you, Jesus. You're awesome. I want to be more like you. This whole mess, I don't know. I don't want to have anything to do with it. It doesn't work. It is a mess. We're not denying that, but that does not work. To reject Corrine is to, in effect, reject me, right? Jesus doesn't allow us that option. Here, listen, you cannot engage in a fair-minded, honest reading of the New Testament, the basis for the Jesus we love, and walk away thinking with any sense of reasonableness that Jesus would be okay with us loving him and ditching, ignoring, discarding, disregarding the church. There's just nothing in there. You would have to mutilate your New Testament beyond recognition. Now, I thought about, well, what verses am I going to point to? There's just too many. There's too many that support that idea. But, besides the others, let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. This is a chapter later from what we were reading where Paul was critiquing the church. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 21, this is what he says, the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. That's not how this works. There's a coordination that has to happen here. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. In fact, when the eyes and the hands and the feet don't work in coordination, it's a real problem. As we get older, we realize that, the body parts aren't working like they're supposed to, and that's a problem. Why didn't I take advantage of the thriving in my youth? But things are starting to break down. But that's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not a good thing. I'm just not going to get rid of the hand or the head or the eye. I mean, that's not how it works. Verse 22, on the contrary, those parts of the body that seem weaker, they're indispensable. We cannot live without those weak parts of our body. He says, verse 23, and the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable, we treat with special modesty. It seems that the ultimate failure of I love Jesus but not the church is that that's just simply not an option Jesus gives us. It's just not an option. We have to figure out how to make that relationship work. We have to figure that out. Now, acknowledging that there's failure, but we have to figure that out if we want to love Jesus. You can walk away from the whole thing. I don't think you should do that. But to love Jesus, we have to figure out how to love the church. So where does this leave us? Where does this leave us? We're going to wrap up with this. Where does this leave us? What do we do? How do we love the church? Especially if you've been hurt by it. Years ago, I was visiting a church. I'd never been there before. I love visiting churches, one of my favorite things to do. And it was Mother's Day. And they had given all the ladies a rose. It was Mother's Day. It's a nice thing to do. So at the end of services, we're gathering up, full room, gathering up our stuff. And I didn't see that the lady I was sitting next to had set her rose on the ground. This is a true story, not a friend hates my wife story, by the way. Just in case. She had set this rose on the ground, and I was, gathering up my stuff, getting ready to go, and I absolutely crushed this rose that was on the ground. Trampled like a rose on the ground. Made me think of those lyrics. Anyway, she was upset. She was pretty miffed. I don't know why that rose was so special. I mean, I understand. I felt bad. My instinct immediately was to feel bad. I didn't know how to solve the problem, but pretty quickly I didn't feel bad anymore because she started letting me have it. I mean, she wasn't just out rude, punching me, but it was clear. Her body language, her tone, that kind of, watch where you're stepping, what in the world? And I'm thinking in my mind, what are you talking about? Why are you being rude to me? I didn't know your dumb flower was on the ground. I didn't say any of this. because that's not my personality, but I was thinking it. That is correct. Why is your dumb flower on the ground? And then I start thinking, I'm a guest here. I don't know your rules. I don't know what's going on. You should treat me better. You, madame, are the problem. I didn't say any of that, but that's what I'm thinking. I had this reaction like, hey, this is kind of your fault. And besides, it's your problem to treat the guests nicely. And I started thinking, your mind starts really winding up. Like, what kind of church is this? I mean, what kind of preacher do they have that doesn't teach their members to be nice to the guests? I mean, I'm never coming back here. This is a bad church experience, right? Maybe I'll even give them a bad Google review. Members were really mean when I accidentally stepped on flour. That doesn't really. So on this way out, I see this horrible church member talking to a greeter at the front door. And the greeter said something to the lady. Oh, thanks for visiting us today. We're glad you could be here. Yeah. And it dawned on me. Both of us were visitors. And I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing she maybe let the greeter have a piece of her mind about that rude member that had crushed her flower into oblivion. I'm guessing that she was having the same negative thoughts that I was having, and we were both looking at the other person saying, it was your responsibility to do better. You need to do better, not me. And we're both guests in this scenario. Interesting. We tend to assume that everyone else is the problem. Can I let you in on another sad truth? You have all had bad church experiences. There's a really good chance that you have been someone's bad church experience. Yeah. You didn't expect that, did you? You were like, oh, Patrick, now that's a left turn. That's not really fair. I just wanted to play the victim here, and now you're telling me that I'm part of the problem. Yeah. We're all part of the problem. But that's good news, because it means that we can be part of the solution. There's this, this is back in the turn of the 20th century. The Times of London sent out this question to a bunch of leaders and thinkers of the era. And the question they wanted them to write back to the Times with like little guest essays, guest columns, was this: what do you think is wrong with the world today? What do you think is wrong with the world today? So they got back all these essays. This is in England, Great Britain, and the essays were about like crime and industrialism, and the worst, the big culprit, was Irish immigration, because the Irish people are the worst, and they were just making everything terrible and awful. That was like the big, huge problem, and they're getting back all these answers. There's this great thinker, philosopher, Christian thinker, philosopher, theologian. His name is G.K. Chesterton. I'm going to read you his response in its entirety to the newspaper. He wrote this: "Dear sirs, I am sincerely G.K. Chesterton. What is wrong with the world today? It's me. I am part of the problem, and I am experiencing the problem because other people are also part of the problem. I have not been able to get this out of my mind, and so if I don't say it, it's just going to be sticking in my brain forever. But I've been thinking about the words, the sage advice from one of today's modern philosophers, Taylor Swift. It's me. I'm the problem. It's me." I've been thinking about that all week. Now you have to think about it too, and I hope you listen to it in the car on the way home. Here's the crazy thing about the church. Yes, we are the problem, but we are also the solution. We're the solution. The redemption that we can experience through Christ is something that we have been given the freedom to offer to other people that are the problem and are causing bad church experiences. All right, I've been honest. This is why church is tough, but here's why it's great, and we're going to spend much less time on this. Three things. Church is great because it is a place to love and be loved. I have never experienced more love than I have from people that consider themselves followers of Jesus and participants in the church. I have. This is me. I don't know about you. This is me. I've never experienced more undeserved love than from people who consider themselves followers of Jesus and participants in church. It's a place to give and receive grace. I have never experienced more grace, tangibly experienced more grace than I have from people in this room. I have none of the other groups and organizations that I do stuff with have I experienced more grace than from people in this room. And number 3, it's a place to grow and be grown, because I hate to break it to you, you are not perfect yet. And the opportunity that imperfect people provide you to become a more perfect person is invaluable. The opportunity that other people provide you to show grace and to give love, even when the situation feels like it should call for distance, is invaluable. None of those things, that list can be done well on one's own. I want to wrap up with this quote. I don't have it on the screen. I'm just going to read it to you. Philip Yancey wrote a book called Church, Why Bother? And I have a copy. You're welcome to borrow it. And he grew up in a terrible church. He talks about his church. It was awful. It was pretty involved in some pretty rough things. And he says for a season that he left the church. But I wanted to share this quote with you because I thought this was so valuable, because I think it articulates something that is hard to experience unless you've given up on the church. And so if you're sitting here thinking, yeah, I'm feeling pretty good, that's fine. You don't need this. But if you're feeling like I got one foot out the door, then this may be helpful for you to hear. Philip Yancey writes, he goes, at a deep level, I sense that the church contains something I desperately need. Whenever I abandon the church for a time, I find that I am the one who suffers. My faith fades. And he says, the crusty shell of lovelessness grows over me again. I grow colder. And what he's saying is when I create distance from the church, it's not the church that suffers, because you know what? Matthew chapter 16, verse 18 says, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. The church will not suffer, but you will. The church won't do bad. It's going to be just fine, but you will suffer. That's Yancey's conclusion from experience. I want to tell you this, and then we're going to wrap up. I said that a couple times already, but I promise it this time. I promise it. That bad church that I went to when I was 12 years old, it was bad. I still think about it. I'm just like, that was a bad place. That was the congregation in which I took my first steps of faith. That was the church I got baptized in. Now, some of you are like, well, you just got baptized so they would like you. No. I'm telling you, it's somehow through the mess and the badness and the meanness, somehow the light still got through. Isn't that an Anne Lamott quote from Leonard Cohen? There's cracks in everything, and yet that's how the light gets through. And that's true. The light gets through imperfect people, and it filters its way down to people who need to hear that message of redemption. 12-year-old Patrick. It filters down into 12-year-old Patrick, where he takes his first steps of faith. And he realizes that even bad church can be used by Jesus. On this rock I will build my church. The gates of Hades, mean Christians, bad experiences will not prevail against it. I think we can and should critique church, but I don't think we can love Jesus and not the church. And I think you will be better for loving the church. We're going to sing a song in closing. I'm going to invite the praise team back up. But there's so many songs that we could sing about what it is to be a part of this community. And I just pray that you will have some opportunity to evaluate that. Acknowledge that there's problems, but to evaluate the fact that there's so much good, even through the problems, even along with the problems, that it's worth loving the church. Let's stand and sing together.